I'd like to pose my third set of questions to Yao from Asset. Looks like the structural transformation process among African countries has finally started to resemble the process in other parts of the world. What do you think has changed over the last 10 to 20 years to change the direction of structural transformation in Africa? And what do you think ought to happen to further enhance the pace of transformation and raise the quality, such as to bring reality the dream of prosperous economies with solid job growth and income creation?
Thank you. First, let me thank IFPRI for inviting me to participate in this important and timely conference. I work for the Africa Center for Economic Transformation based in Accra. Our sole mandate is to promote economic transformation in Africa through studies and also advice to governments in Africa on policy and institutional reform. We are based in Accra. The staff come from several African countries, and we work in several African countries. Has structural transformation really started in Africa? I'm not sure. One thing is for sure, there's been growth since the mid-1990s, which has reversed the trend of the previous 2 decades. Like the picture that John showed here, we've looked at the growth experience in African countries since the 1960s. And if you take 3-year averages to even it out, since African economies are volatile, you see that broadly in the late 60s and early 70s, per capita GDP growth is not that different from the growth that we've been celebrating in the late 2000s. We're roughly around 3 to 4% per capita. The growth in the earlier period did not last. What is to say that the growth that we are having now since the mid-1990s is going to last? We in Asset believe that the reason why the growth in the earlier period did not last was that it wasn't based on solid economic transformation. And what we mean by economic transformation, to us in Asset, economic transformation means growth with depth, D-E-P-T-H. And I'll elaborate on that later on. But before that, let me comment on what generally we've heard today, and also is normally talked about when people talk about economic transformation. They usually talk about structural transformation. And that's basically in the paradigm of the old Chinnery Sequin model, which has been resurrected recently by Roderick and Macmillan. And I guess Usman was also publishing that tradition of structural change, meaning shifting labor from agriculture into the other parts of the economy, higher productivity sectors, and that they're accompanied by higher productivity in agriculture. We find that concept helpful but outmoded and not very directly useful for policy. As the presentation of Usman showed, there have been movement out of agriculture in Africa. There have been some productivity gains, but unlike the old structural transformation experiences in other parts of the world, this labor that has been released by agriculture is not being absorbed by increasing manufacturing. What we have is labor going into the urban sectors, into low productivity services, and essentially what we have is perverse transformation. There's really, yes, to the extent that there's been transformation, is perverse, and it's nothing to be celebrated. And we need to change that. And so for us, we look at this thing, economic transformation, through the lens of what we call the depth, growth with depth. The D is for diversification of what we produce and export. If you look in many African economies, most production is based on primary production. In fact, the level of manufacturing in Africa generally has fallen from the over 10%, 12, 15, 16% in the late 60s, early 70s to now less than 10% in most African countries. It is not consistent with structural transformation. Of course, we do not take structural transformation to be just manufacturing. Any sector, high productivity sector, it could even be high value services. So diversification for us is very important. That's the D in the depth. E is for export competitiveness. This is a globalized world, and to survive, African economies need to be able to be competitive in the global market. When you take mineral or resource-based exports out of the exports of African countries, and you look at the shares in the world, and look at it on the trend, they're very pitifully small, and they've been going down. The P in the depth is for productivity increases. If you look at agriculture, sure, there's been a moderate increase in productivity. But if you look at manufacturing, productivity has been going down in African countries. The T is for technology upgrading. There's no way Africa is going to really transform its economies if we do not upgrade technology, and if we do not have the skills and the scientific competence to really adapt and also produce our own technologies. If you look at what Africans produce in the manufacturing sector, and you classify them using the large decomposition method, and then you look at what the share of manufacturing that's in high or medium productivity class, is very low. In almost every country, it's less than 10%. If you similarly look at exports, same. And also, if you look at African exports, manufacturing products, from about the 70s up to about 2012, you look at the top 10 African exports, and you see how they've evolved over these past, that period from about mid-70s to about 2012. And you look at it, whether they are low productivity, medium productivity, or higher productivity, you would see that there have been no upgrade. And you compare them to other places in Asia, Latin America, developing countries, you will see that there have been very little change. And in fact, in many countries, there has been a drop from medium productivity to low productivity export products. Lastly, the H in our depth framework is for what we call human welfare improvement. And we just summarize it by two variables. One, the obvious one of per capita GDP. Yes, in many African countries that's growing. But another part of it is, the way that per capita GDP gets translated into a broad sector and shared prosperity growth or inclusive growth is through expanding employment opportunities. And this we measure by the share of formal sector employment in the labor force, which you can decompose into the share of formal sector employment, share of the formal sector in employment multiplied by the total employment rate. In many African countries, this rate is about 20% or less. And there's really no way you can make GDP growth inclusive if you do not expand this thing. So for us, in asset, economic transformation means growth with depth, and this is the framework that we use. And by this framework, and in fact, we released a report last year where we discussed this, and we discussed economic transformation and reviewed the history of it over a 40-year period, comparing Africa to 8 comparator countries in East Asia and Latin America. And then we've translated this depth framework into an index, which you can do. But, not to be all gloom, there's hope. The growth in income provides us the means to invest in transformation. There have been, improvement in education, which we can use to build on transformation. And there's also improvement in policy, as was showed by John. So we have something to build on, but there's still a lot of work to do. Bringing it directly to agriculture, I think next year we're going to do a report on agriculture using the depth framework to really look at what's going on in agriculture. And in fact, we think it's a very critical part of the transformation process. And again, as many people here have said, we don't look at agriculture as separate from industry. It's a continuum with starting from the production side where we need to upgrade productivity, but also filling up the value chain. Because a lot of the jobs in agriculture are not necessarily going to come from people working on farms, but will come from the people working in the allied agri-businesses and the agro-processing. And then, anyway, and a part of what we need to do is to move agriculture from a poverty reduction framework into a transformation business-oriented framework. And that's what we're working on. Thank you.